permanent. We therefore need to think now about the process to roll back emergency measures and other pandemic justified restrictions. We need to provide safe space for civil society to defend democracy, protect rights, combat corruption, give voice to those silenced by power, simply stated, to make the world a better place. Today, we'll hear from a remarkable group of people, and I thank all our speakers for joining us today. To kick off our conversation, we'll hear from Director General Johannes Oljelund from Sweden's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We express our appreciation to Sweden and SIDA for being a global leader on civic space and for co-hosting today's event. Your focus on civic space issues is critically important. We'll then hear from Ambassador Samantha Power. I've seen firsthand how Ambassador Power and USAID are tireless champions for civil society and civic space around the world. Ambassador Power, it's an honor to have you join us. Thank you. Guiding our discussion is Fionnuala Ni Aolain. Fionnuala is the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and Counterterrorism and a professor at Queen's University Belfast and the University of Minnesota Law School. Fionnuala is also one of the world's foremost experts on emergency powers. In closing, I hope you find today's discussion thought-provoking and useful. On behalf of all of us at ICNL, I extend a warm welcome to the over 1,000 people around the world who signed up for today's event. And now I turn the meeting over to our distinguished moderator, UN Special Rapporteur Fionnuala Ni Aolain. Welcome.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Doug, for that welcome. So I'm really glad to be here to discuss with you all this really significant and timely topic. I'm Fionnuala Ni Aolain, as Doug said, and I'm going to serve as the moderator for today's event. Together with the ICNL Alliance, the mandate I hold has been closely tracking state COVID-19 emergency powers, looking at the emergency response across the globe. And what we've catalogued have been around 480 measures that negatively affect freedom of association, peaceful assembly, expression, and the right to privacy. This new slew, if you want, of emergency powers builds on and extends the extensive and normalized use of exceptional counterterrorism and security powers in multiple states since 9/11. So that all of that is worrying in its own right. This wave of restriction is even more concerning because actually we know from past crises, whether we go back to the Roman dictatorship, to the concentrations of power during the government's use of powers during the Second World War, to the normalization of the exception across multiple conflict, transitional, and post-colonial states, we know that once emergency powers are adopted, they have this pernicious tendency to normalize, to persist, to become permanent. So today we're going to discuss how COVID-19 measures adopted by states have affected civil society organizations. And on our first panel, we have a really rich array of groups from across the world to talk about how these powers have affected them. In the second panel, we're going to talk about how governments, bilateral donors, and key international bodies can play a key role in ensuring that COVID-19 responses do not become permanent restrictions on civil society and civic space, and how we can actually start now to protect civil society during this emergency, but also for future emergency. So I have the very great pleasure to introduce two champions of civic space for today's discussion. The first is Johannes Oljelund, the Director General for International Development Cooperation at the Swedish Foreign Ministry. And our second speaker is Ambassador Samantha Power, Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. As Doug said, a champion for human rights across the globe for many years. So we're really pleased to have them both kick off this conversation. So let me first turn over to Johannes, please. Johannes, if you're ready to start, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you to ICNL and SIDA for organizing this topical event, and thank you for the chance to say a few words. I'm very honored to share that possibility with the Ambassador Power, of course, and I in that context, want to convey my apologies from my minister, Minister for International Development Cooperation, Per Olsson Frid, who I know would have wanted to be here. He's on an airplane, and well, Wi-Fi on airplanes is still not good enough, so bear with me. The topic of today's discussion, civic space after COVID, could not be more timely. I think that the historic perspective of the Roman dictatorships showed that it's a continuously important issue, but nonetheless, the last year has been a very real challenge, also in terms of access to civic space. And we know how much it's a precondition to democratic societies to ensure pluralism and also the very real strength and innovative power of civil society to contribute to the improvement of our societies. And of course, the trend of global democratic backsliding includes the shrinking of civic space very, very clearly, threatening independent media and civil society, and this has increased, including abuses of human rights and so on. I've seen estimates that in 2020, only about 3% of the world's population lived in what were considered open societies, truly open societies. And over 40% of the world's population lived in countries where democratic space was severely limited, and 25% lived in countries where democratic space could be considered closed or completely closed. And this is as a development person, of course, this is a major hindrance to the effectiveness of development cooperation and implementation of development strategies and humanitarian assistance, simply because civil society organizations are key partners in Swedish development cooperation, but also in development cooperation in general, of course. Out of SIDA's total budget, 40% reaches civil society directly through financial agreements, and civil society organizations are also key in our engagement through the multilateral. So it's very essential to our ability to be a development cooperation partner. Simple as that. And we have seen in the past year also how limitations of civic space have combined with other consequences of the pandemic to produce very, very worrying trends. Emergency measures to mitigate the pandemic has brought enhanced health risks for women, girls and boys in terms of increased gender-based violence and limited access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. Numbers already show that gender-based violence and the number of early and forced child marriages have increased. And furthermore, the disruption of essential health services has caused major setbacks in maternal mortality. Civil society is crucial in advocating for women and girls' enjoyment of human rights and in upholding health services where public resources are scarce or non-existent, and during the pandemic also directed to other uses. By restricting civil society to operate, the consequences for women and girls have indeed been both severe and even life-threatening. And we have also seen some impressive results of how reinforced efforts to cooperate with civil society organizations to counter this have worked. So I'd like to just mention a few examples. One is the Turkish CSO Association for Struggle Against Sexual Violence that we support. Among other things, they have developed a website for women who are subject to violence in order to inform on how to seek help. And in the DRC, we support CSOs such as International Alert, who are preventing gender-based violence through projects aimed at young people and addressing masculinity norms and gender roles. So while challenging, we still think it's possible to try and reinforce efforts also in this field. And I think at the core of this for us as a donor lies it's important for us to focus on how we can extend this support effectively. Seek more effective donor policies and practices in order to enable civil society to maximize their contributions. And for support to be effective and in a specific country context, we need to have a stronger engagement with civil society, and which is always a challenge, but also to be able to be more flexible and adaptable in responding to needs, including on our financial requirements. We've been able to do some of that, but I'm looking forward to today's discussion to see how we can get more inspiring ideas. So I'll stop there and just want to extend my sincere and warm thank you for hosting and for organizing this event, and for giving us the opportunity to have an in-depth discussion and learn from each other in this. Thank you.
Thank you, and really particularly glad to hear the emphasis on the relationship between the protection of civic space and democratic space, both of which are so intimately related. It's now my great pleasure to turn the floor over to Ambassador Power, who's going to make some remarks. Over to you, Ambassador Power.
Thank you so much, Fionnuala. Great to see you. Thank you, ICNL and CIDA. And thanks to each of those I've thanked for your many years of leadership to promote human rights, and sadly, a growing number of years fighting back against the closing space, the issue that brings us together today. Thank you to Director General Oljelund and to the government of Sweden for your ongoing commitment as a longtime donor and as great partners, certainly to the United States in the countries where we work together. President Obama used to have this expression, which is, don't admire the problem. He would get really frustrated with us sometimes in meetings because we'd spend a long time admiring the problem. But I'll start by joining others in admiring the problem and just touching on the trends that are so disturbing. The fact that regimes are using COVID as an excuse to suppress dissent, silence the media, and tighten their grip on power. All trends underway before the pandemic, but trends that have intensified and accelerated in different places. I think it just puts more pressure on the rest of us to figure out how are we going to up our game in response to this disturbing exploitation of a horrific pandemic. In early March, thousands of people amassed in the streets of Asunción, the capital of Paraguay, to protest the government's corrupt handling of the COVID pandemic. Protesters blamed a shortage of basic drugs and medical supplies on pervasive corruption and graft. And when I got into my job a few weeks ago, I spoke in my first week to David Riveros Garcia, who's a leading anti-corruption activist in Paraguay. His organization, Reacción, is combining civic education and technology to shed light on corruption and to mobilize young people to combat it. And he shared a couple of things that I relay that will not be news to you, but the extent to which, from his perspective, the government of Paraguay has hidden information during the pandemic, kept information from the public, and shuttered civic spaces, making it even more difficult for citizens to do as they did in the protests, which is to gather and hold governments accountable. But more interesting in a way, because we've seen those trends play out everywhere, was his perception and view that civil society now needs to adapt more quickly than it has to counter corruption of the lines along the lines that he described. And for him, this meant really sort of taking this moment as a wake-up call, not to concentrate themselves, civil society activists, that is, in large cities, but break out into the rest of the country so that civil society actors are representing the needs of grassroots communities and visibly representing those needs. The way he put it, he said, civil society organizations will have a hard time claiming legitimacy if they don't touch people's lives directly. And his concern, speaking again just on the basis of his experience in Paraguay, was that some civil society actors, and this is all something, of course, that the regime would perpetuate, but risk being seen, as he put it, as poor cousins of the rich elite. So that this populism that is rising is actually targeting civil society and claiming that this is a kind of elite enterprise, and with some getting traction in that regard. I thought that I think that these are words we can try to take to heart, and again, especially seeing the extent to which governments are using these portrayals to deepen their repression or their infringement on space. So the alarming numbers that we see, I think, are bracing. In addition to speaking with David, I spoke in the last couple of weeks with activists from South Sudan, Serbia, Malawi, Tunisia, and the Philippines, organizations that CEDA and ICNL and Fionnuala, I'm sure, hear from often. And just was really striking the extent to which they were afraid, fearful not only of the effects of current government restrictions, but really concerned that these, once COVID is gone, and we're a long way from that, I know, but that these are lasting impacts, that these have been locked down now as the new normal. And so what are governments to do now, given the state of things, since we're not here to lament the state of democracy? I think first, to remind ourselves every now and then that no matter how much ground autocracy has gained, every indicator shows that democracy remains popular in every region of the world. Trends are trends, but individuals make trends. And I think the future of so many parts of the world right now are being contested every day. And that's why governments are closing civil space, fearful of that contest. There have been a record number of protests in recent years, especially right before the pandemic, calling for more accountability and political reform, including the woman-led protest movement in Sudan that toppled a leader indicted for genocide by the ICC, a leader that most of us thought would be in place maybe for the rest of our lifetimes. In 2019, mass pro-democracy demonstrations reached an all-time high, even higher than during the Arab Spring or the end of the Cold War. And we know again that these trends in terms of the crackdown on civil society predated the pandemic and were a very real issue in 2019, and yet those protests occurred. So people are voting with their feet, and it is often young people who are leading these protests. So what should we do? I've just started taking on the leadership role at USAID, and we are asking ourselves this question, and we are eager for bright ideas and innovation, every bit as sophisticated as the sophistication of regimes learning from one another how best to stifle civil society voices. A few thoughts just in closing. I think as governments, we have to be ready to respond quickly to support democratic openings that arise organically and often with little warning. I was at a donors conference last week hosted by President Macron of France, trying to support Sudan, including through debt relief and support for social safety nets at this incredibly fragile time for the civilian transitional government, and a fragile time for civil society, when the gains made so far, again, feel not yet at all locked in. Second, I think to be more sophisticated, and that's easy to say and harder to do, but more sophisticated in fighting misinformation and disinformation. Recalling especially that lies about civil society have helped turn broader public opinion against civil society. Again, this portrayal as elite and out of touch, or corrupt, or foreign imperial agent. What is the answer? And how do we pool our resources to get better at that? No democracy has cracked the code on fighting misinformation or disinformation, but it's something we have to put our even in our own societies, never mind as we think about supporting actors abroad. We have to support increase our support for independent media so that journalists and those who document abuses, including civil society actors, know that there are people that will have their back, not only when they are being arrested or harassed, but also when they're being sued, which is an increasing tactic to put NGOs or particular publications or news agencies out of business. We have to think about new methods to protect activists and citizens from digital repression, especially by regimes that are growing more sophisticated and have ever fancier tools to surveil and censor their population. And then lastly, I would just say that I do think more concentrated work in support of those who are documenting corruption is important. That is a real Achilles heel of those who seek to curb civil society and close that civic space. So just thank you for having us. Those are just a few thoughts, all of which should have programmatic and policy instantiation, and eager to hear more and learn more from the discussion that you have there today. But thank you for having me.
Thank you, Samantha. So I think one of the things I take away from that reflection is very much how we have to be innovative. And we're seeing it already. I think one of the things we'll hear is how civil society is itself learning anew, figuring out how it really manipulates the space, comes around the space, works closer across boundaries, we're seeing, and that's reflected in today's discussion about the ways in which, as governments work more closely together, often to be repressive, actually what we need is a collective response from civil society, and also that we learn to work in really transversal ways, new and innovative ways that break down the barriers and the silos among different kinds of movements. And that, I think, is where so much of the innovation lies. So now we're going to bring in our audience. Apropos technology, we very much would like to, having thanked both our esteemed guests who started our conversation, we're going to see a little bit what the audience thinks. And what we're going to do now is move to a poll. So I'm told this is going to have us tell you have you tell us a little bit about what you see in the space. Many of you, I think, will have participated in these kinds of polls before. And what you're going to see, you'll have had a link to identify the question, and you are going to be asked to answer this question, which tells us a little bit about what the experience of the hundreds listening online is this morning. So the question is whether throughout the pandemic, whether your government's response to COVID-19 has negatively affected democracy and human rights. And you're being asked through the link to identify whether that's the case, whether it has negatively affected democracy and human rights, whether you think it hasn't, it's had no effect, or whether you simply don't know. And so if you take a minute or two just to see what we're finding as we have people joining us from across the globe, then that will give us a sense of what kind of experiences we're seeing across the globe. So we're just going to take a minute or two to get a temperature in the virtual room. And so let's see if we can, if we take 1 minute more, and then we're going to see the results here. And so from our audience, we see 180 participants identifying, consistent in many ways with what the ICNL's tracker has been showing us, a negative impact on democracy and human rights from the use of measures. And this is a hard space because, as we know, the context of a health pandemic has meant that measures are necessary, but it's always the case whether these measures have been proportionate, non-discriminatory, and necessary in the way that they're used. So let's go to the second question. We have one more question for you this morning, I think, and you'll see it up here in front of you again. And I think what this is really trying to do is disaggregate the kinds of experiences that we're seeing at the country level to better understand where you live or work, whether any one of these measures has been evident to you in the course of the last year and a bit. So it asks us to sort of assess which challenges have arisen in the countries that you live or work in. Restrictions on peaceful protest. We just heard from Ambassador Power how we've seen some of that in action. limited access to information, we're seeing that too, overbroad surveillance, chilling of free expression, or whether some of us are living in places where none of that happens. And so that would be good to know too. So if we just take it, and you can fill in as many of those boxes as you like, it's not singular. And again, that gives us a little bit of the temperature, given the large audience we have today and the multiple countries that people are calling in from. And we're just going to put up the answer to that question now, and you'll see. So one of the most obvious ones has been the restriction on protest. And that's consistent with the data we're seeing from multiple countries. Less in terms of access to information, although again, country by country breakdown sort of indicates significant variability in this area. Overbroad surveillance, an important issue that we've already had raised by Ambassador Power again, underscoring the extent to which much of that is invisible to us for reasons that these are often spaces that are least seen and least overseen. Free expression, again, 57% of the audience, and none of the above. So 7% of us live in places where this doesn't appear to be true. So I think that gives us a really good way to jump into this second panel. And what I'm really delighted about is the opportunity to have a number of extraordinary speakers with us here this morning, a really wide variety of human rights voices from around the world. And just also to note, all of the individuals speaking to you today are at the front lines in different ways of really seeking to defend human rights in some of the most difficult contexts. So we have Liam Herrick, a surfeit of Irish people with you this morning, calling in from Dublin. And we have Deanna Guzman, we have Hoshar Mallow and Shamini Darshani. So really delighted to have you all here today. And I'm going to start, Liam, we're going to do this by way of conversation. I'm going to start, Liam, and ask you a couple of questions around in a way to sort of frame where we are, to understand where we're going to. And of course, Ireland is a robust democracy. And the question here really is whether the government's response to COVID-19 has consistently protected rather than restricted civic space. And maybe you could talk to us about some of the impacts that you've seen in a country where the presumption might be that there are no negative impacts.
Thanks, Fionnuala. Yes, as you say, Ireland is a robust democracy. It's a strong and open democracy, which has a good record on protecting civic space. And indeed, Ireland plays a leadership role at the UN Human Rights Council on advancing civic space. Under COVID, we have not seen the types of targeting of civil society, trade unions, or journalists that some other countries and some of our other colleagues today will speak about. But what we have seen is a bending of some democratic norms, which do give rise to concern and which have the potential to set dangerous precedents for the future. There hasn't been a state of emergency declared in Ireland. The government has adopted legislation which gives the Minister for Health unusual powers to introduce restrictions on daily life. And indeed, the government has introduced restrictions on movement, on the holding of events, on wearing face coverings, for example, all of which have very far-reaching interferences with rights, but most of which have enjoyed strong public support. The difficulty that we see is that the government has failed to really have human rights in the conversation when it's developing its laws and its policies. And as a result, some of the regulations have certainly exceeded what might be deemed to be necessary or proportionate. For example, we've had effectively blanket bans on religious observance during periods of time and on the right to protest and strike. And we see three particular weaknesses with the Irish government's approach. The first is that they have consistently blurred the lines between what is law and what is mere public health advice. The government has followed poor practice in introducing legislation, and on many occasions has introduced legislation without even making those rules public. Secondly, the government has marginalised the role of Parliament. The very broad power that the Minister for Health has had has not involved putting new rules before Parliament for scrutiny, even though the National Human Rights Institution and civil society have consistently called for this safeguard to be introduced. And thirdly, by criminalising what are public health matters and giving the police powers to arrest and punish individuals for things like leaving their home without reasonable excuse, we have drawn our police, our community police service, into regulating parts of daily life, giving them powers of stop and search which are not normal and which are in danger of being embedded if they're not quickly removed. The concern really at this point in time, after 14 months, is that temporary measures, which were undoubtedly required for a period of time, are now becoming more normalised. And what we're seeing this week is that the Irish government is going back to Parliament asking for an extension of the current ministerial powers until November of this year. We are concerned that what was meant to be a short-term measure is now becoming a more medium-term measure. And there's no shift towards re-establishing parliamentary oversight, the role of Parliament, or no sign of removing the criminal justice enforcement of public health measures. We have experience in Ireland on the counter-terrorism side of where temporary measures introduced during the conflict in Northern Ireland have been retained 20 years later. And some of us are concerned that we're now seeing a tendency from government to be reluctant to relinquish strong executive power. Ireland, we feel, does have the potential to show a leadership role in this area, but it needs to show good example. And this week's debate in Parliament, I think, will be very telling as to whether Parliament reasserts its primary function in relation to legislation.
Thanks, Liam, and thanks to ICNL for continuing to highlight those issues domestically. I do think this focus on the marginalisation of parliaments, of the democratic process, which is sort of built into the DNA of emergency powers. By definition, that's what emergency does. It marginalises the participatory, as well as this theme of the securitization of health, where security and health become locked into this grip with one another, is one of the things, the trends, the global trend lines that we're seeing that I think are distinctly worrying. Let me turn to Shamini, who is the Executive Director of the Asia Forum for Human Rights and Development based in Bangkok in Thailand, with extraordinary wide regional experience. And I really want to focus, Shamini, on the threats that are posed by emergency powers to civic space in Asia. You speak from a place of leading 21 organizations that work in 21 countries, a network of civil society organizations right across Asia. I guess I'd ask you to tell us, what trends are you seeing across the region for your members, for the organizations, and what's the impact that you're seeing across that region of COVID-19 emergency powers on civic space? So we'd really welcome that big picture from where you're sitting in Bangkok.
Thank you very much, Fionnuala, and my thanks to ICNL and CEDA as well for organizing this much needed discussion. Forum Asia and our members have witnessed several key trends on the impact of COVID-19 emergency powers on civic space, three of which I would like to share with you today. The first trend, as we've also heard from Ambassador Power, is on the rising authoritarianism through securitization that is impacting civic space. During COVID-19 restrictions, protests and gatherings have been banned or restricted. This has compromised the spaces for dissent. Some governments have been using these restrictions to promote or implement legislation that would further enmesh securitization in both private and public lives. These include a new law in Kazakhstan that was introduced to set limits to the freedom of peaceful assembly. In the Philippines, we have seen the fast tracking of an anti-terror bill that has vague and wide provisions on the definition of terrorism. And also in the Philippines, we are seeing how the practice of red tagging of activists and defenders by labeling them as terrorists continue during COVID-19. In Sri Lanka, for example, a human rights lawyer and advocate for Muslim minority rights was informed by the Ministry of Health that officials were coming to visit his home to test him for COVID-19. Instead, police officers turned up, arresting Hijaz Hizbullah and confiscating documents of his cases without any warrant. Similarly, in Indonesia, an Indonesian NGO worker, Rabio Patra, was arrested by plainclothes agents after his WhatsApp was hacked, and we suspect for criticisms of how Indonesia was handling the pandemic. Yet another example is in India, where in the first 2 months of the pandemic last year, the government published a list of 190 projects for environmental clearance, bypassing meaningful input from civil society. These are only a few examples, but across Asia, we are seeing the common theme of how the authoritarian agenda, which was already prevalent before the pandemic, has now intensified. This has caused fear, but at the same time, it has shown civil society's strength and resilience, even as civic spaces are trudged upon. The second trend I'd like to touch on is how new and existing laws and measures introduced during COVID-19 are enabling online surveillance and control by the state. The use of contact tracing applications to counter the spread of the pandemic is one of the critical responses of government. But civil society has raised concerns about the potential for violations, which include violations against privacy, as well as to monitor movement in a region where data protection, personal data protection laws are already lax. We've seen this in Thailand, in Myanmar, in Singapore, for example. We've also seen how repressive laws are being introduced in different countries in the region. Myanmar is proposing a cybersecurity law that will enable the military to control information, shut down the internet, and amass data of its people. Bangladesh, and as another example, saw 38 cases filed under the Digital Security Act, which criminalizes anything defined as propaganda. My final point, and I'll keep this brief, is on the trend of the increased targeting of human rights defenders. This draws home my first 2 points on rising authoritarianism and state surveillance. Between February and December 2020, the period where the pandemic began affecting us globally and how states were beginning to introduce containment measures, we find that there were 119 violations affecting 415 people, made up of human rights defenders and their families, as well as individuals within their communities. The most common types of violations that we are witnessing are judicial harassment, arrest and detention, denial of fair trial rights, and SLAPP cases, which are lawsuits seeking to criminalize human rights defenders for their legitimate work. Media workers, with 34 cases documented during that period, were the most affected group of HRDs, mainly for reporting COVID-19 related issues. This was very closely followed by violations against women human rights defenders, pro-democracy defenders, land and environmental defenders, as well as labor rights defenders. In our monitoring, state actors were responsible for 90% of these cases. As a side note, Forum Asia will be releasing our biennial Defending in Numbers report next month, which elaborates on some of the data that I've just shared with you. Thank you very much. Back to you, Fionnuala.
Thanks, Shamini. I think this is one of the sort of really important points you've made, amongst many others, is just the public-private space that we see emerging in the use of emergency or exceptional measures, the lack of robust micro-level analysis of that interaction, as well as I think what is a very clear gap that many of us are seeing in the technology security space, the lack of oversight globally, the lack of normative standards or a clear sense of how they ought to be applied. The results of which are this sort of really witch's stew of both, not just the sort of normative level, but the harnessing of that to sort of private-public partnerships, if you want, as well as the harnessing of technology, often technologies that have been developed in the counterterrorism and security arenas, being transferred into the health arena in ways that are exceptional, but really very, very under-scrutinized and underseen in the current moment. I'm going to turn to you, Hoshar. Hoshar Mala, who's the Executive Director of the Kurdistan Organization for Human Rights Watch in Iraq. Thank you for joining us later in the day for you than for many of us, Hoshar. And I really want you to tell us, Hoshar, what your experience in Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan has been. Is it similar to what Shamini is seeing in Asia? And in particular, if you could tell us how COVID-19 emergency measures are affecting civil society organizations in your country, that would be great.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Fionnuala, and thanks to ICNL and SIDA and all the participants. I'll try to keep it very brief. Yes, it's the same, and sometimes it's worse than what was mentioned by Shamini. The arbitrary measures by Iraqi government and also Kurdistan regional government, and they're continuing. I mean, still we're living under those kind of, we call it the midnight decisions. Most of those decisions by Iraqi government and Kurdistan government are like late night decisions, and they're applied for the next day and this kind. But if I classify, I will brief them in two main bullet points. So the first one will be forbidding and stopping or prohibition of protests in Iraq, and calming down of activists and narrowing the space for activists in Iraq. We have our friends and colleagues that were arrested because of criticizing some of those decisions and measures that were taken by government. I mean, it became a good excuse for both federal government and regional government, Kurdistan regional government, to put their opponents into jail. And the second thing will be using this exceptional power for the suppression of opponents, for even against political parties, against those NGOs that are not in line with government. I mean, our organization was stopped and prevented from distribution of humanitarian food assistance for returnees in the post-conflict areas in Mosul, in Anbar, and many other NGOs. They were stopped of their humanitarian operations. The bottom line here is that still in our country and in many countries in the Middle East here, still human rights, civic space is not in the essence of the decision-making process. It's not something that governments are considering when they have this kind of, especially this kind of emergency measures. So, I mean, I hope for the upcoming, I mean, still we're under the measures. Still, every day there is a new decision, and at the end of the day, the civic space used to be narrow, and now it's narrowest situation that we have ever faced in the country.
Thank you, Hoshar. And I want to turn now to Diana Guzman, who's the Deputy Director of de Justicia in Colombia. And Diana, the world has really watched in recent weeks Colombians coming out in large numbers to protest the response to COVID-19. It's been quite extraordinary. And of course, we've also watched the meeting of that protest by police repression and by extraordinary violence. Can you tell us a little bit how those protests are linked to COVID-19 responses, how those two things are connected?
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think the current situation in Colombia exemplifies what happens when a state manages an emergency prioritizing authoritarian measures over democratic ones. Right now, my country is at risk of having a democratic break amidst escalation of violence in the context of social protest and police repression. Since April 28th this year, Colombia has experienced significant unrest associated with a national strike, which reflects social concerns regarding a plurality of social and economic issues. I'm going to provide a couple of examples because analyzing the whole situation is very complex, but a couple of examples of the reasons behind these massive mobilizations that we have seen during the last weeks. First of all, the pandemic has exacerbated poverty and inequality in Colombia, which was already one of the most unequal countries in the Americas and in the world. There are also concerns regarding delays and problems in the implementation of the peace accords signed between the oldest and largest guerrilla group called FARC and the Colombian government in 2016. Finally, there are some concerns as well related to the killings of human rights defenders and social leaders. In the middle of this discontent or concerns, instead of prioritizing social dialogue to deal with the protest, the government has fostered the stigmatization of demonstrators, has allowed the militarization of cities, and hasn't rejected the increasing police repression. This has created a human rights crisis which threatens to engender either a sustained social confrontation or even turn towards autocracy in the country. This current situation connects in different ways with the government's response to COVID-19 pandemic. First of all, an attempt to pass a tax reform to deal with the economic consequences of the pandemic was a key factor raising the social discontent behind the protests. While economic measures are very much needed in the country, the lack of social dialogue around the proposed measures engender the sense that this was an essentially regressive policy. And so many people decided to march in the streets against this policy. Secondly, this trend towards authoritarian measure that I was describing has also been part of the Colombia's response to this pandemic. We have seen in the past year severe restrictions to liberties in absence of effective control from other state institutions. According to the Bloomberg COVID resilience ranking, Colombia ranks 50 out of 53 countries, meaning that this is one of the countries with the most ineffective handling of the pandemic, reflecting significant social and economic disruption from mortality and testing rates to vaccine access and freedom of movement. And there's also a lack of transparency regarding measures adopted to deal with the health crisis. For example, we have seen a lack of transparency regarding the vaccination plan or how the government purchased the vaccines. There's also a poor quality of information in those cases where data are available. And finally, there are a lot of problems to access information that would allow civil society scrutiny regarding these issues. I think that crises and emergencies should be opportunities to deepen democracy and the respect for human rights. Instead of that, in Colombia, we have decided, or well, our government has decided to go towards a more authoritarian path, creating significant risks for democracy and human rights.
Thank you, Diana. I mean, I think it's extraordinary. You know, crisis is an opportunity, but of course, opportunities run in different directions. But I think that finishing point that you make, the importance of thinking about the opportunity, I think takes us away from, as Ambassador Power said, the beauty of the problem to really thinking about how do we bend this problem to our will? How do we think about reframing the problem in ways that do exactly that deepen democracy, that actually affirm the rule of law, that make the rule of law possible, that delivers at the grassroots the needs that people have to see the state and systems work for them. And I think that's so critical as we've seen the challenges faced at that kind of micro level in people's lived lives in the last 18 months. And so I'm going to go back to Liam, and maybe just thinking about how ICNL, so you set us out a set of really big problems for us, for a very prominent and functional democracy in many ways, and you've described the challenge. So I wonder if you could tell us how organizations, including your own, have responded to that, have sought to safeguard rights and freedoms, and what do you think's been most effective for you? What's worked? And we're going to do this as a lightning round because I'm conscious we're going to stay on time, or so we have everyone speak. So if you could give us just your quick thoughts on that, that would be great.
I think what civil society has tried to do in Ireland is try to ensure that the most vulnerable to the pandemic and to the restrictions were visible, and to ensure that there was effective tests and safeguards in place against excessive use of power. And we've had some notable successes. For example, on the COVID tracking app in Ireland, there were strong privacy and data protections built into it. And with some vulnerable communities, including street homeless and minorities such as Irish travellers and the Roma population, good support systems were put in place to respond to their exacerbated vulnerability. I think, though, as civil society, where we've seen difficulties is that the government has really refused to put in place consultation and policy-making structures where human rights could have been properly taken into account. And that would have avoided a lot of the negative mistakes that the government has made around some of its policy decisions. One of the differences, I think, between Ireland and what we've heard about in Colombia, and we're deeply concerned at what we're seeing in Colombia today, is that there was leadership in Ireland from the police and the criminal justice agencies about moderation in the use of excessive powers. Whereas the powers they were given, we feel, were too broad. They very clearly from the beginning articulated a concern about the danger of the police getting involved in public health. And because of that, I think a message and tone was set from the top that there should be a very moderate use of these powers. So I think that has been a real positive. Certainly, there's been uncertainty about the right to protest, which has made it difficult for social movements to be able to express themselves with certainty that they mightn't be prosecuted. And also the marginalization of Parliament has had a really profound effect on civil society too, because that is how we would often seek to express ourselves and have influence. So I think it's a mixed picture. But certainly we would hope that Ireland now as a wealthy country and in the EU could start to show global leadership on issues such as access to vaccines. And I think there's a question now of countries coming outside of their national interests and engaging with questions of international solidarity. And we'd like to think that Ireland might play a role there.
Yeah. No, I'm really struck by this idea that participation doesn't happen because we want it. We have to create these spaces of inclusion, and it's really hard. The challenge is always in crisis, trying to force your way into the conversation as civil society, rather than government understanding and seeing that actually better policy follows. You might actually not have it so hard to do the work you want to do if you engaged in positive processes of engaging with communities directly. Maybe, Diana, back to you. My mandate in particular, I spend a lot of time thinking about the lasting effects of these exceptionalities to the detriment of human rights, and how we undo these lasting effects. I wonder if you would talk about what you see briefly as the long-term implications for human rights and civil society in Colombia, and any positive remarks or anything you see that sort of lights a way through this.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I would like to start by saying that since 1991, when a new constitution was enacted in Colombia, we had significantly advanced towards a reduction of space for exceptionalism, because during the 70s and 90s, hand in hand with the violence associated with the armed conflict and drug trafficking, exceptionalism was part of daily life in my country. But now we are, the biggest risk for me is the risk of normalizing what used to be exceptional. So we have seen how the government has decided to militarize the protest. And so there's this risk of going back to the militarization of life. we are at risk of having regular use of curfews and other restrictions by mayors and governors. It's not only what the president does, it's also what mayors and governors are doing in terms of the reduction of liberties and the limitation of different liberties. And of course, there's this big risk of securitization of civic life. The government has relied also on stigmatization and criminalization of protest, which obviously also reduces the space for civil society to actually engage in democratic ways to deal with crisis. And so I think there are very interesting opportunities to face these risks if we are able to strengthen civil society organizations in the context of a crisis. The problem is that these organizations are also facing different problems, different challenges associated with the pandemic and the authoritarian measures related to this pandemic. So there's this conjunction of human rights crisis and the COVID-19 emergency that it's severely affecting civil society organizations' work, both in terms of the overload of work and the fear of an economic crisis that could reduce even further the space for civil society organizations. So I think we need to take very seriously these challenges associated to the opposition to authoritarianism and to regressive economic policies. And also we need to try to really tackle these challenges that civil society organizations are facing. I think there's a lot of opportunities, as I said during my first intervention, coming out of a crisis, but we really need to understand what this crisis means for civil society organizations in order to provide enough means to deal with the challenges.
Yes, and of course we see that even just from the sort of survival of civil society in terms of the negative effects of funding, the capacity to function, the capacity to operate, much less the kind of externalities all of these things face civil society actors at every level. Hoshir, you talked about how some of these extraordinarily negative effects on civil society, but as you look forward, as you're standing now looking forward, what would you like to see the government of Iraq do differently? And how do you think, particularly given the impact and the engagement of the international community in Iraq, how might the international community help Iraq find a better path in navigating this post-COVID exceptional world?
Yeah, thank you. Well, what the government should do, many of our activists in Iraq, they call the pandemic a gift for the government to use against protesters. There were ongoing protests when pandemic started last year. So it was by many of activists. They named this pandemic as a gift for the government. I believe we can take advantage of this experience as a lesson learned, as something I believe we were not that successful in handling. As Iraq or maybe many other countries. So I hope this will finish soon. And the lesson learned is, civil society is the positive side of the community. We believe that it's the positive energy in the community. So the governments can take benefit or advantage in two ways. First one is the consultation, talking to the civil society before issuing a decision or emergency decisions. They can communicate better. The second one, civil society in our country and many countries are having the role of complementary for the government services. Government cannot provide services for many people at the same time. So civil society can fill those gaps. For the international community, I believe even many people are here. they can help in a way like issuing reports, practicing more pressure on our governments, and providing more recommendations for our government, how to communicate, how to consult, how to discuss the decisions with the civil society. And of course, don't forget that Iraqi government is taking care of its image in the international community. So they listen. And the other side, I believe the international community, international donors can provide more support for enabling the civil society in Iraq. I believe those are the main 2 points in my mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Hosher. I mean, I'm struck just by the clarity of saying that if we see the problem, hardly it's actually seeing the extent to which the kinds of measures taken are having a distinct, definite, and negative impact domestically, then it focuses attention. So in defining the problem, we actually sometimes offer a way to see solutions to it, and it's really distinctly focusing on this problem. Shamini, I'm going to close with you in this session because you've really focused us on the role of both national and regional civil society organizations. Maybe just to tell us how briefly you've seen civil society respond to overarching emergency powers. How are you working with national and regional mechanisms to provide greater protections? The kind of forward-looking piece briefly from you to close us out as we go to our next poll.
Thank you, Fionnuala. Okay, so for Forum Asia, what we've seen is within their own countries, Asian civil society continues to advocate against the use of repressive laws used to crack down on human rights. They're taking action where the government is not or can't. Civil society at the national level reaching out across borders and using the social media platforms to form loose social movements and provide solidarity to one another. One of the examples of this has been the Milk Tea Alliance, which has spread across countries in Southeast Asia, particularly in Myanmar and Thailand. Forum Asia is currently working with the Milk Tea Alliance to advocate for a more constructive ASEAN response to Myanmar. Also, when the ASEAN leaders met last month to discuss its position on Myanmar, a People's Summit had taken place on and offline ahead of the meeting. This saw more than 3,000 people joining the event to demand the cessation of violence and for military accountability in Myanmar. Emerging social movements driven by the youth have been the face of protests in recent months, and they've been raising issues such as the Myanmar coup and the deteriorating situation in Hong Kong. Civic movements are changing, they have changed, and we need to be able to tap into this growing resource in both partnership and support. As Forum Asia, we have 2 key national and regional advocacy targets. At the national level, we work with national human rights institutions where we have a focus to see NHRIs in country be strengthened. And second, a regional advocacy target is ASEAN. So to give you a couple of examples here, together with our national NGO members, we have provided analyses to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights and to the ASEAN senior foreign ministers on the trend of civic space and human rights in Southeast Asia. Where we work with national human rights institutions, we published a report last year as Forum Asia to study how 13 NHRIs in Asia have been responding to emergency measures used in the pandemic. To summarize that, in short, the responses by NHRIs were varied, but one cross-cutting commonality across NHRI responses was how there was a lesser focus on human rights defenders. So to close off, in short, CSOs and human rights defenders in the region have adapted themselves and their work to the restrictions imposed on in-person gatherings. And since last year, most have moved their activities to online formats to organize webinars, training sessions, and consultations, or where possible or allowed to introduce hybrid models. although the increased use of platforms have actually exposed civil society actors to more online attacks and harassment, on the other hand, we have also seen how digital knowledge and competencies of CSOs has increased. And this includes having a greater awareness on good practices and tools to enhance digital security. And with that, I thank you very much. And back to you, Fionnuala.
Thank you, Shamini. No, I love some of the innovation we're seeing. I think it's again, we tend to look at the problem, but actually then when we stand back and we see the extraordinary innovation of civil society, even the extraordinary innovations we're seeing in protest on the ground, the way people are learning to protest in times of great restriction and to do so safely, I'm struck by the resilience of civil society and also the newness and the freshness of it. So many new movements infusing the discussion in different ways. And so I think we have to hold on to that as much as we're holding on to the difficulties that we're seeing and see a way forward. So we're now I'm going to thank Shamini, Deanna, Liam, and Hoshar for joining us and giving us that just rich and very grounded sense of the challenges of emergency powers on the ground for organizations and individuals alike. And also thank them for their forward thinking, how to get us to a better place. And so we're actually going to go back to audience polling. This is to wake everyone up if you haven't, if you need woken up before the next panel. We just want to invite you again to join us to think about some of the issues in a more concrete way. And we're going to offer you another panel poll. It's just one this time. And maybe it's in reflection on what you've heard that you might tell us whether you're confident that the rights and freedoms that have been affected by COVID-19 will be restored after the pandemic. So this is an optimism poll. It's to check whether you feel things get better or worse, but also maybe to give us a sense of how we understand, again, the challenge that we've been articulating, I think, so strongly in these remarks, is just the historical and practices that we know that emergencies are really sticky. They're very hard to undo once you've gone into that space. We've seen that over time, over geography, over legal system, and over culture. And I think it's sort of a welcome to focus on that. Maybe we can get a result. Oh, we do. So we have 16% optimists, which is, it's always good to have optimists in our midst because they help us think through problems, but also a large number, 61%, 129 of our participant listeners saying that they're concerned that these rights and freedom won't be restored. So with that, we're going to close our poll. And I have the very great pleasure in moving us to our second panel. We have, again, a really important panel of different stakeholders exploring how governments, bilateral donors, key international bodies are going to play this really important role in ensuring that COVID-19 responses and restrictions do not become permanent, that they don't infect our legal systems, our governance, and most particularly, that we're not going to see this undulating restriction on civil society and on civil society actors maintained into the future. Because if they are, of course, it affects the health of everything else, from our economies to our governments. So it's my very great pleasure to invite our three speakers to speak this morning. We have Karim Yantin, who's the Director General of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA. And on behalf of ICNL, I think I'm again saying how welcome this leadership by SIDA is on this issue, how important it is to be convening this conversation at this time. I'm also really delighted to have Lisa Peterson, who's the Acting Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor in the United States Department of State, join us. Again, really important that the United States and this new administration is turning its attention to the perniciousness of this issue, not least because actually it has a tendency and the possibility of affecting so many other issues where progress needs to be made. And finally, I'm really delighted to introduce Solomon Dresso, colleague, another staunch advocate for human rights, the chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, who've been doing some extraordinary things through COVID in speaking out and maintaining and articulating for and behalf of human rights and the maintenance of the rule of law. So with that, let me first turn to Karen. Karen, if you don't mind, we heard in the very first panel how, in very great depth, how COVID-19 measures have restricted civic space and curtailed public participation. And CEDA, I think, has admirably recognized the role of civil society and participation. You've made clear that this is how sustainable development and equitable development will happen. And so what role do you see for CEDA and other development organizations in addressing these emergency measures that have been adopted during the pandemic? How are you going to ensure that what's there will be necessary, proportionate, and legitimate? And how do you address the negative effect that these measures might have on the works and the communities that you're most closely working with and supporting?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for an excellent cooperation. I would like to reiterate that. And before answering your question, I would like to take us back a little bit, and that is before the pandemic struck. Early 2020, we were all of us talking about two things, if I could put it shortly. The one is that it was the beginning of the decade of action, 10 years till 2030. The other thing, which was a negative discussion, so to say, a description of a negative situation on the globe, was that the civic space was shrinking. The number of people living in democracies were fewer and fewer, and we were all deeply concerned about this, even before the pandemic struck. Meaning that I'm not saying that the pandemic has not played a role, but when the pandemic goes away, because it will go, or it will, the effects of it anyway will fade out after vaccination and other things, we will still be here with the challenges, no matter had there been excessive, too much of lockdowns or not during this period. And I'm not saying this to make it negative, rather the work is even more important. We decided early on at CEDA, when the pandemic struck, to continue, or rather we recognized that our priorities were, to say the least, valid when the pandemic had struck. We always work with two perspectives, a rights-based perspective and the perspective of the poor. And we said that all of the projects, interventions, etc., that we were to do had to have these two perspectives at the front line, meaning that we wanted to support the poorest and the ones being struck the hardest. And when I say poor and poverty, it's economic poverty, but also lack of power and right. In both these senses, women and girls and children have been struck the hardest. We also recognize that we have been working for many, many, many years with core support to many of our partners, not all of our partners, but to many of our partners, also in the civil society structures, also with the civil society organizations, meaning that they were given and this meant that we could give them rather the possibility of restructuring the budgets to make their work, to adapt their work to the situation that after the COVID had struck. The other thing that is that we also recognize that we had long-term and trustful partnerships with so many of our civil society organizations. But we also had and still have, I think, long-term and trustful partnerships with many of the governments in the countries where we work. And we try to use that voice to remind the governments of what kinds of conventions they have to live up to support the human rights of everyone and protect civic space, enlarge it, etc. But also try to actually press them a little bit and to make them realize that it's more effective for them actually to have a good relationship with their civil society organizations rather than the opposite. So financing, trustful partnerships, core support, and putting a bit of pressure on governments. Those would be our main ways of working. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I mean, I'm struck by that. In some ways, it's a very old-fashioned recipe in the best sense of the word, right? That often there are no like sort of shiny magic bullets to say, because these are long-term intractable issues. Governance is a long-term process. Ensuring that states see the value of their civic space is a long-term conversation. But I'm also really struck by the kind of push and pull factors here, the way in which actually relationships and the goods that a donor brings to the table actually shapes the conversation in positive ways, and deeply grateful for that articulation and the importance of it. Let me turn to Lisa, because I know many of the similar kinds of issues, challenges, methods of working are also part and parcel for you of the work that you do. As you know, and I don't need to tell anyone on this panel, as COVID-19 has hit countries all over the world, we've seen just this immense strain on the most fundamental things: health, most obviously, education, and on economies, on just people's ability to work. Lots of these things might be just thought of as domestic issues that countries kind of have to get on with and deal with on their own. But you help lead the US protection and promotion of human rights abroad, and you're also a former US ambassador. So how do you think, in that role as state-to-state engagement, can the US encourage countries reeling from COVID-19 to take care of civil society? How do you convince them that this is actually both in their own self-interest, but in the broader interests of the globe on all of these markers? And what kinds of tools and conversations, Lisa, do you find most helpful to advance that conversation?
Thanks very much, Fionnuala. So I'd like to emphasize that diplomats can play a crucial role in raising awareness around the importance of civil society's engagement on both the COVID immediate issues, but the broader ongoing engagement that has to happen between civil society and their governments. So as an ambassador and now leading promotion of human rights, I have an even better view of how diplomats can support civic space and the impact that COVID-19 has had on civil society. I think in addition to encouraging respect for civic space in our bilateral engagements, diplomats can be pivotal in bridging the gaps that exist between governments and civil society when they don't necessarily effectively work well with each other. This is a role that can manifest itself, for example, in efforts to facilitate dialogue, informal dialogue, not the kind of dialogue that requires negotiations around negotiations, but informal encounters between host governments and civil society to build that encouragement to respect civic space, but also work with civil society in partnership in a way that is responsive to societal needs and interests. I think it's important that diplomats use their access to government to help amplify civil society concerns. I also think it's important that diplomats reach beyond the like-minded group and find ways to access countries that are in a middle ground, maybe not necessarily willing to speak out unless they get some encouragement, and use that space to build that confidence. More broadly, though, I'd like to underscore the importance of countries that embrace civil society already to lead by the power of their example. There are a number of ways they can do this. They can demonstrate the very real benefits of a strong civil society by highlighting that protecting and expanding civic space has made them more resilient in their fight against the pandemic. Civil society organizations, many of us see them in many ways as allies, and they can help build trust in government, efficiently convey public concerns to authorities, support the delivery of essential services, and press governments to share critical updates to counter disinformation and misinformation. Obviously, a strong respect for civil society is a necessary part of the solution to public health crises and is key in mitigating epidemics and pandemics. We think another way for states that are already inclined to support civil society is to actively support civil society beyond their borders. So in this regard, the US is equipping civil society through programmatic efforts with knowledge, skills, resources, and space to conduct effective advocacy around the world on human rights and governance issues, including in connection with the pandemic's impacts.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm really struck by the sort of some of the motifs in your remarks, the point about formality and informality, the power of informality, I think is certainly one that I think is often underrated in terms of what can be done in those spaces. But I also just concur with you about the signaling power, what it means when democracies bring their civil societies with them into UN spaces or into bilateral spaces or into negotiation spaces. That signaling is really important. I've certainly seen it in the counterterrorism and security space when states stand up for civil society in those spaces. It makes a difference, and it's a very small number of states doing that. But it's power in terms of just signaling and in amplification and really making clear that it's not just talking the talk, it's really walking the walk with civil society by bringing them with you, is really leading by example. And we've certainly seen the US do that in the counterterrorism and security space in particular. So let me turn to Solomon. Solomon, I know that we've heard a lot about civic space restrictions in the name of COVID globally, and we know that that's also been true on the African continent in the past year and plus. I wonder if you could tell us how you think regional human rights mechanisms are part of the remedies to the challenges that we're seeing to civic space, what you're seeing in the African context more broadly, but also what you see the remedies that in particular the African Commission offers as an example of the role of a regional mechanism speaking in this space.
Thank you very much, Fionnuala, for the kind invitation that ICNL and the partner organizers have extended to me and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. It's really great to be here to discuss about this extremely important topic, which affects not only the engagement of civil society organizations in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, but importantly, with respect to the process of democratization and indeed on issues relating to governance, which in the African context, I would imagine, as in other parts of the world, had also been brought to a spotlight in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The experience here on our continent with very diverse states, with different legal systems and capacities and levels of political and democratization. Similar experiences that have been shared earlier in the previous panel in terms of the various measures that have been adopted by governments across the continent, taking the form of states of emergencies, declarations of states of disaster, and also health emergencies, and the adoption of very extraordinary measures with drastic impacts on the enjoyment of human and people's rights. Our commission, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, as the premier human rights body of the African Union, started to engage on the issue of making human rights the front and center of the response to COVID-19 measures very early on, when only less than half a dozen states on the African continent reported the presence of the COVID-19 pandemic in February 2020. And we issued at that point in time, on the 28th of February, our very first statement on the measures that the Commission expects states to adopt, not only with respect to the protection of the right to health, the safety of persons, and also the right to life, but also importantly, how those measures need to be adopted in terms of procedurally speaking, and the need for compliance with the standards and principles laid down in the African Charter. So from our perspective, it was our recognition at the time that in the face of the very serious threat that COVID-19 was posing to health and life, it was imperative that under Article 1 of the African Charter, the states, as they are required and pledged, to take the necessary measures to spare their population from the threat that COVID-19 poses. Basically, signaling that not doing so would be contrary to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. All right. And we also underscored this point that actually, from an African perspective, given the state of the health infrastructure and the health system, that member states and states parties to the African Charter take preventive measures rather than respond after basically the spread of the virus, so that the impact of the pandemic would be less than it would otherwise be if it is allowed to spread. Of course, as far as the impact of the pandemic is concerned, at least in the early days of the pandemic, its impact on health and life on the African continent has not been as serious as in other parts of the world, as we have witnessed. And indeed, it has become very apparent to us that more than the health threat that the pandemic poses, the COVID-19 pandemic response measures would entail the most serious consequences to the enjoyment of human and people's rights on the continent. And indeed, the measures that have been adopted across the continent and the consequence of those measures have proved us right in terms of the fact that indeed the response measures have been having some of the most dramatic impacts on the enjoyment of human and people's rights, whether that is in respect of the closure of the already eroded civic space, but also in terms of issues relating to, for example, the rise to epidemic proportions of gender oppression, which we declared to be an emergency on its own within the emergency because of the scale of sexual violence, domestic violence, and other forms of oppression that women and girls have come to endure in the context of the various measures that have been taken by governments, and the disruption of some of the services, including, for example, the support service that civil society organizations have been giving to those at risk and indeed have faced various forms of violence. And other issues, such as, for example, excessive use of force by security forces. And indeed, we were extremely saddened by the fact that what is actually a health pandemic has been securitized so heavily to a point where some countries, to our shock, have been putting on the streets their tanks as a way of enforcing the COVID-19 measures. And for us, this was, very shocking. COVID is not a military enemy for which you bring out on the streets your tanks. COVID is a health response that requires actually not a security response, but rather more of a health and humanitarian response, even in respect of non-compliance with the COVID-19 response measures. So the Commission actually, in the course of the year, have done a number of things. One, obviously, condemning the various draconian measures that have been adopted by states, which led to arbitrary arrest and detention, affecting in particular journalists, civil society organization members, and the opposition politicians and dissidents in respect of specific countries, but also broadly speaking, through the issuing of both targeted statements, but also generic statements on freedom of expression and access to information, on human rights defenders specifically, and as well as issues relating to excessive use of force and the impact that this has, particularly on the most vulnerable and the poor sections of society, and the discriminatory impact that this has, again, in what we consider to be the criminalization of poverty, which we strongly objected to, since it's only people who are trying to meet their ends on a day-to-day basis who are caught up in this process. And of course, finally, we convened a session of the Commission that brought together states parties, civil society organizations, and national human rights institutions for purpose of having a deliberation on the measures that have been adopted and the impact these measures are having, and what this means from the perspective of the African Charter, which culminated in the Commission adopting Resolution 449 that has become the most important framework for guiding states parties measures, but also the actions of civil society and national human rights institutions. Thank you very much.
That's very helpful. It's also just enormously, I think, sobering for us all to acknowledge that in some contexts, the measures taken are worse than the pandemic itself, and that in real time, that's true. But also that the communities who are most impacted by COVID are being responded to by measures that are actually measures that exacerbate and undermine their existing rights in ways that I think we all would find deeply troubling and inconsistent. We're going to do a quick lightning round so we stay on time. So I'm going to go back to Lisa. And I think, Lisa, what I'm struck by with this is the look forward moment for us all very quickly. We're in a place where we, I think in some countries at least, are looking forward to the day when COVID will subside. And I guess I would ask you what you think the US can do in this context to make sure that the ebb of the health crisis doesn't leave in its wake a host of residual emergency measures that will restrict civic space and actually undermine the other really serious issues, challenges, work that the US wants to do. So just your quick thoughts on that would be much appreciated.
Sort of building on a theme of tried and true practices, I think using some of the tools that we've already deployed, but making sure that we have a post-COVID-19 focus. So things like the work that we do along with Sweden and other governments through Lifeline's work to ensure that civil society has the support it needs to survive and thrive in the face of new restrictions and threats, but also in working against and trying to eliminate those new restrictions and threats. We will keep using multilateral and multi-stakeholder fora, the G7, the Freedom Online Coalition, the Community of Democracies, a variety of those fora to support joint actions that call on governments to ensure democratic responses, both during the crisis and after the crisis. Again, the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor will continue to implement our programmatic responses, but we'll also be continuing activities such as our work with ICNL to document COVID-19 related restrictions, try and track where we're able to chip away at what has come before. And finally, we need to address the pandemic's lasting effects by working to improve our and the world's preparedness for the next pandemic. And part of that requires supporting transparency, information sharing, and fundamental freedoms such as expression, association, and assembly, and the other tenets of democratic society. So really strengthening that muscle once we're past this phase, so that when we get to the next one, we're better prepared.
No, I hear that call to strengthening those particular muscles. It's the idea that those muscles have sort of weakened and atrophied somewhat in this time, and it's sort of one of the kind of DNA lines of emergency and exception is that it does create that atrophy on certain rights. It's like things have to be reawakened and supported. Salman, I'm going to come back to you again and ask you maybe again, sort of in enlightening form, as it were. You've really articulated this role that the African Commission has taken in sort of standing out ahead of what it's seeing states doing and being proactive, which I think has been extremely important and not as well done, if I may say, by some other regional bodies or even some of the international oversight bodies. I think the African Commission has been particularly articulate and out ahead of so much of what we're seeing. But I guess what I would ask you to think about is how do you think, aside from the internal work that's being done on the continent, how can outside allies of civic space help support the work that the Commission and others are doing in the African human rights and civic space context?
Thank you very much once again. The Commission, by virtue of the mandate vested in it under Article 45 of the Charter, can and indeed is mandated to establish close working relationship with regional and international organizations that are working on human and people's rights. So it has been one of the most important areas of engagement of the Commission, addressing and indeed working with various international organizations and both non-governmental and intergovernmental organizations. During the pandemic, for example, we at the African Commission have engaged in a dialogue with the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and the ASEAN Human Rights Commission that was as part of basically experience sharing and lessons learned. Myself, together with the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the UN, issued a joint statement with respect to some of the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and urging for specific measures and actions being taken. In the course of our deliberations during the Commission, civil society organizations openly are invited to make submissions during the sessions of the Commission, to participate in the spaces that the Commission establishes and creates, including, for example, with respect to the elaboration of specific norms or guidelines with a specific reference to the issues that we have faced, including with respect to the civic space. So, for example, prior to the 66th organization of the Commission, civil society organizations, what we call the NGO Forum, they convened a meeting. And on the basis of that meeting, because we deliberately designed that 66th organization to focus specifically on the human rights impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and COVID-19 response measures. And civil society organizations, through their deliberations, submitted a proposal on the issues that need to be addressed. And that is the background and the basis on which we adopted Resolution 449, which I invite all of you to have a look at. And then, importantly, we have adopted another resolution 447, which aims at adopting guidelines on making human rights the foundation for any state of emergency or other extraordinary measures that states may adopt. This is currently a process that's underway, and one of the participants in that process is ICNL itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Solomon. And that's really that the depth of that engagement, I think, is striking, and the openness to it, I think, particularly important as this whole session and on our previous conversation has stressed the importance of creating space for civil society, leading in an institutional sense by making that state possible. And Karma, I'm going to close with you. You get the final words on this panel. And so past these two panels, I think we all have an understanding of how widespread and serious civic space challenges are from the COVID-19 context and from COVID-19 measures. And I think it's fair to say that we can't assume that COVID-19 will be the last global emergency we'll face. In fact, as we talk about climate justice issues, the language of emergency is also seeping into that space. So looking ahead, how do you think CEDA and other allies of civic space can help ensure that we've learned some lessons from this crisis, and that they're not forgotten when the world faces the next crisis, or we may even already be in that crisis, we just haven't named it yet? And what concrete measures do you think governments in particular, but perhaps CEDA has learned and can take forward from this to prepare for the next? So over to you.
Oh, many. We are in the phase of assembling what we have learned, but we'll continue to do that. Many of the things that we have learned were pointed out equally by Lisa and Solomon. We'll continue work by supporting concretely civil society organizations, supporting them by core support, making it possible for them to work on their own account by their own decisions in different ways. Of course, it's a human rights issue, but it's also a delivery issue when it comes to Agenda 2030. But some points I would like to raise specifically. One concrete area that we are working to try to increase our support to or work in is to work directly towards grassroots organizations and informal structures and movements in different ways. They are often even harder struck than big civil society organizations, and they are more exposed and unprotected. But it's also very challenging for us to channel money, to be concrete, and to support them directly, as they are not structured in the same way as others. But we are seeking ways of supporting those kinds of organizations more directly. A concrete area that was mentioned by, I think it was Ambassador Powers, but I'm not really sure, was digitalization and new technologies. A couple of weeks ago, we hosted the Stockholm Internet Forum, which is a biannual event gathering people working around the human rights online and the right to express oneself and the right to information online. We will continue work in this area in many, many ways, supporting structures, organizing meetings, etc., and develop the digital arena and the right to information and the right or the support rather of human rights online. That is another area that is important to continue work around. One important instrument that is coming to life, I was about to say, but we have supported and contributed to the DAC policy instrument on enabling civil society. It's the first international commitment focused on the action of donors in the area of civic space and civil society organizations. There is a work now being done to make it a recommendation. We'll see how that work goes, but no matter what, it's an important instrument to put the finger on the house. What should the donor do to actually support civil society organizations and civic space in a better way? This instrument also actually points out the responsibility of the civil society actors to work in a more effective, transparent, and accountable way. So it also spells out a little bit to the civil society structures, how they should work. So we work both with the legal side of civic space and civil society actors at global level with the DAC policy instrument, but also in other ways. At country level, with trying to support our partners to make them stronger in pushing for legal and regulatory changes that opens up civic space and doesn't continue to close it. And then we'll continue to try to find new ways of supporting new kinds of movements in the world, which is becoming more and more digital, but with the same kinds of rights agenda as a basis for everything. So thank you, and thank you for good cooperation. Let's continue.
Yes, thank you, Kerem. And I want to underscore just the importance of your attention to digital space, which is, I know, that an issue that's just so central to understanding how we actually move both our organizing, our work, and our rights into this new space that is so profound and essential. But also just the practically focused nature of your solutions, the finding of instruments, the mainstreaming of values and virtue into work. And so that's really much appreciated. I'm going to thank our three panelists, Lisa, Kerem, and Solomon, for that just exceptionally broad-ranging and really practical set of both ideas and implementation, which I think is exactly what we need to take these debates forward. And I now have the great pleasure of taking us to our final panel. So thanks to the almost 300 people who've stayed with us for 2 hours this morning. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our two closing speakers, Nicholas Opeyo, who from Chapter 4 in Uganda, and Ilse Brandes-Kearns, who's the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights at the United Nations, both of whom are extraordinary advocates for human rights, both of whom are dealing with, in very different institutional contexts, the challenges that we've been talking about this morning. So I'm going to turn first to Nicholas, who's going to give us 5 minutes of remarks to both inspire us and help us take our work forward. And then I'm going to go to Ilse, who is going to give us marching orders for the road ahead, I hope, or at least direct us and give us her thoughts on how the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights and the UN system is conceiving of and doing, I know, such essential and important work in this space. Nicholas, over to you to start.
Well, thank you very much to the panels and for your deep, thought-provoking discussions on the topic. Thank you to ICNL and its partners for putting this discussion together. As they said, my name is Nicholas Opeyo. I'm a human rights lawyer based out of Kampala, Uganda. In January 2021, Uganda held its elections that returned President Museveni to power for a 7th term. These elections were held in an atmosphere of extreme restriction of the freedom of assembly, speech, association, and other rights. Needless to say, this has been the same condition in many African countries that held elections in this time. In Tanzania, Burundi, Ethiopia, in Ghana, and Burkina Faso, and many other countries that held elections. The point to make here is that these restrictive measures were already taking place in a situation of fast shrinking civic space in many parts of the world, in both old democracies and emerging democracies. This makes the challenge even more serious, that these emergency measures already add on to already precarious situations around the world. It therefore makes it more urgent for all of us to reflect very deeply on the impact of these emergency measures on civic space, and in particular on the work of civil society. It is not all gloom though, because in this period, we've also seen a resilience of the civil society sector in these countries that I have mentioned, and indeed across the world. The unity of purpose, the collective actions of many CSOs, in spite of the difficult conditions, have shown that there is great value in a stronger more coherent civil society. What then is to be done to arrest this dangerous situation? First, I think for me that the power of moral leadership cannot have been more important than now. Countries like Sweden, the United States have got to master their moral power to lead the campaign to draw back on emergency measures, as well as refocus on the shrinking civic space across the world. This moral leadership, in my view, should compel these countries to take immediate steps to mobilize communities of democratic states around the world through the United Nations, the African Union, the European Union, and many intergovernmental organizations to take a deep reflection on the impact of these emergency measures in an already difficult circumstance of shrinking civic space. These should, in my view, propel them to take political actions to ensure that states immediately begin to draw a roadmap to going back to normalcy, to ending these emergency measures, and ensuring greater protection for civil liberties across the world. These actions are possible because if we do not do anything, we have heard already from the panels that these measures tend to become new normals and set dangerous standards for the enjoyment of civic liberties across the world. The second thing, in my view, is that we have to have a concerted, perhaps even more increased investment in civil society organizing around freedoms, human rights, civil liberties in particular. Because the tendency in this kind of period is for us to invest in the health interventions in an attempt to combat the pandemic, a good thing in itself. But in the long term, this must not be at the expense of deep investments in civil society. I dare argue that beyond organized civil society, we must find innovative ways of exploring support to differently organized groups, otherwise known as informal groups in some circles, because these groups are at the forefront of the fight for civil liberties. They are at the forefront for the fight for human rights. In fact, there are cheaper ways of intervening in situations where we need to intervene, because for them, it is a matter of life and death. And the limitations provided by formal registered entities in many countries like Uganda is that they're limited in their actions because of the laws under which they operate. So finding ways of supporting informal or otherwise differently organized groups will be important in confronting the challenges that these emergency measures have left us behind. The third one, and we've really talked about digital rights and groups organizing online, but the third one is multi-stakeholders. This is not going to be only actions of states. It will require the involvement of multi-stakeholders in examining the impact of these emergency measures on civic space. Because if we don't examine it and understand its impact, we may not know what has to be done or the extent of the problem. So investing some time and resources to investigate, to document, and to present the impact of these emergency measures will perhaps inspire us to greater actions. This will include hearing the voices of local activists and making sure that our interventions respond to their needs. I cannot emphasize enough that these interventions are necessary in developing countries as it is necessary in developed countries. Indeed, a collective action of civil society actors will only be meaningful if we come together as a community of activists, learn from each other, because the experience in Uganda may be different from the experience in Kenya, or indeed the experience in Egypt or in the US. So the exchange of best practices or good practices on how to combat these emergency measures will be very important going forward between the global south and the global north. Already, as we've seen from studies of ICNL and other groups, we're already living in difficult environments of shrinking civic space. We also must not forget that there is also a problem of shrinking civic space, and that our attention also has to be focused on these concerning shrinking space all over the world. Civil society represents, in my view, the best way to mobilize the population, to seek innovative ideas, and to ensure that we put pressure on states to roll back these measures. This is the time, I think, that multinational institutions should come together to examine these measures and ensure that we encourage countries and societies to be able to roll them back. Because if we don't, they represent a new normal, and I dare say a dangerous new normal for all of us. I thank you very much for the invitation and wish you a wonderful evening from a sun-swept Kampala here in Uganda.
We're envious of your sun-swept Kampala. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Assistant Secretary General Ilse to speak to us as we close out the event this morning. Over to you, Ilse.
Thank you so much, Fionnuala. And thanks to CIDA and ICNL for this really inspiring and great discussion. So normally I would have so much to say, but I know we don't have time, so I'll just try to flag a few things and hope that we will go on and explore those further. There are so many great ideas already. We're focusing on innovation, on the path forward, obviously as a beginning here while we're still analyzing. We know that since the very beginning of the COVID pandemic, the entire UN, certainly also OHCHR, the Secretary General, other parts of the UN, and the human rights mechanisms, including Fionnuala, the special rapporteur, of course, have been raising the concern, sounding the alarm really on the emergency measures. And of course, now we have the added concern that we were hoping wouldn't be there on the normalization. So clearly there's a need to maintain the focus. This is, I think, one of the key messages we also got from today. There's the mobilization, so it's not just in the moment of crisis, but making sure that we really, as you said, Fionnuala, use this opportunity properly, and that we really don't slack in our attention to it when we go ahead, but on the contrary, make it more maybe comprehensive and systematic. Obviously, no need to go into the essential role of civil society in this audience, but the obvious need for the open civic space that we already were fighting for before the pandemic hit. But just to make sure that this is really consistently acknowledged, I think we know this, but there are many audiences where this needs, the reminder needs to be there. And therefore also the obvious conclusion that we need to do all of our parts in protecting meaningful, diverse, inclusive participation. I think the point was made very well here by several participants about how we actually look who those actors are that we reach out to. It shouldn't be just going down the list of the most active ones, but making sure that we have a broad participation, are inclusive, maybe including finding ways of giving voice to those who are not organized in specific registered organizations and so on, since giving the voice to the voiceless and supporting them, and the focus on the most vulnerable obviously remains a key point. And the issue of trust, the governance, and so on that we deal with in so many places will only come through this. So the support obviously has to be both political and financial and direct in other ways. This has been discussed today very well, I think. Very happy to hear the inputs on the thinking around the kind of financial support and how to reach through the programming more broadly. But also politically, to make sure that we all the actors have a role in that political support. So civil society itself, the expert community, the international organizations, and also mechanisms, but obviously governments, both looking at the domestic situation of the support that can be given, and there were issues of making sure that the mechanisms are in place for participation and are functional and effective, but also at the multilateral level, so that we really taking the lead to make sure that this really is developed as well. We know, obviously, the limitations, the scope and the duration of the emergency measures, the focus that we've had all along, and the normalization through criminalization and so on, and really in codification, let's say, of some of these measures. So we need to be consistent in our attention and the concerted effort that all of us together have in pushing against this or working against it. I wanted to mention here, because there was several times the mention of human rights defenders and also journalists and, of course, critics of the regime, the importance of maintaining the focus on those who experience repression and reprisals. Also the reprisals for cooperation with the UN as the mandate that we have it, but more broadly, of course, for defenders of rights that very clearly needs also very strong support and focus at this point. So the whole and the context, women and girls, were mentioned several times very clearly. The focus on innovative approaches, and you did it from the very beginning, Fionnuala. I couldn't agree more, but then everyone agreed, so I don't need to repeat it, but just to make sure that we keep it in mind. How do we get about it? Yes, we need that momentum of the input of being innovative, but there are already signs that there are ways that we can really use this opportunity, as we heard. Digital space, fully in agreement of that. And we know, of course, both sides of the digital space. We also, of course, need to pay attention to the gap, the digital gap still, so that even when we do our inclusive participation through it, very clearly, we know that there is a tendency, of course, we do focus very clearly on freedom of expression with digital space. We know that that's a huge problem on both sides. But I just wanted to also make sure that now, again, the post-COVID opportunity of looking and using digital space differently, maybe from what we had before, and the very clear link to freedom of assembly and freedom of association as well. In the freedom of assembly, the General Comment 37 that Christoph Heinz was leading the effort of the Human Rights Committee to produce really had also included for the first time, this not knowing how topical it would be, the digital aspects, but certainly that's something we need more attention to. And finally, we're out of time. So just on the narrative, the centrality of human rights in everything that we do. I think there's also maybe an opportunity to make sure that we pay attention to the narrative that we have, the positive narrative of human rights, not being caught only in this kind of defending, pushing back, and there is an encroachment, but really making sure that we make those arguments for the centrality of human rights and the positive effect that we can have, that we can find the durable solutions only if we do base them in human rights, and using this opportunity to actually really make sure that that is stressed even more. The oversight, obviously, that is needed, we know in all of the different spaces, you discussed it here, but clearly it's something that we will come back to, making sure that there are assessments, human rights assessments of policies and frameworks before they're adopted. So just to finish one sentence, it is the multilateral here is something where we also do have the contribution, joining in with regional mechanisms, having that joined up approach. So there's consistency of messaging as well, making sure that we're holistic in our analysis, that we continue to track and analyze and work together so we really do find those solutions in a real comprehensive way as we go ahead to protect the civic space, to open it up even more, and obviously to work very closely with all of our civil society partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary General. It's really valuable to have you here today to really encourage us with those remarks, and also to affirm the way in which your office and the UN more broadly is seized of this issue and conscious of it. So I'm going to close by saying we have admired and understood the beauty of the problem, I think, from many angles this morning. The problem being the encroachment on civic space by the protracted, sustained and undulating use of emergency powers. And I think we understand the oldness as well as the newness of this problem of the exception. And it's a wake-up call for us all to think about it, to understand what it's doing at the country level, but also to see the opportunities in this moment to push back not only against the use of emergency powers under COVID, but actually to dig out the remnants of sustained use of emergency counterterrorism security problems and practices that have become so embedded, securitization having become so embedded in our way of doing things over many decades. And this is perhaps the moment where we're most acutely aware of it, as we see health and the most fundamental rights of the person being securitized around us. So let me close by thanking ICNL for bringing this extraordinary group of speakers together, and to the generosity of the speakers, all of them really busy people, giving their time to this discussion. And finally, to thank SIDA and the government of Sweden, who've taken such an important leadership role, not only in convening this conversation, but actually rolling up their sleeves and trying to help us find solutions to this problem at a global, regional and national level. So with that, thank you all to our almost over 300 participants who joined us from many parts of the globe, the 1,000 who registered. We'll be sharing the video with all of them. Thank you all for your time, and thank you all for the work done this morning. Good day, good morning, good evening to everyone.